what's important to note is they are quite rare, but they're always there.
We're talking about women rulers in the medieval period, queens, empresses, and today my guest, Dr. Elizabeth Norton, is an historian and broadcaster specializing in queenship and the Tudor period. She's written 12 books and regularly appears on television, and today we're talking about her new book that has just come out, I think about a month ago, called Women Who Ruled the World, and it covers 5,000 years of female monarchy. And you can find a link to her book in the description. Just Feudal Things is a conversational podcast about medieval history with subject matter experts and enthusiasts. In case you missed the last few episodes, we've had several bangers. We talked about the medieval great books with Dcn Harrison Garlick, and the last episode was about medieval warhorses with Dr. Emma Herbert-Davies. Have several really great episodes lined up as well. I believe the next episode is going to be on the Mongols. Could they have invaded Europe? What did their attempts at invading Europe look like? What were the Mongols actually like? This podcast ran for over 2.5 hours. It's a beast. It's going to be a good one. And as a teaser, I will also let you know that I have recorded, but I'm not quite sure yet when it's going to release, a conversation with Professor John Gillingham about Richard the Lionheart. If you're unaware, he is potentially the #1 scholar in the world on Richard the Lionheart and maybe on the Angevin Empire. So that is going to be a great one. Looking forward to putting that one out as well. I may have another episode to pair with it to do sort of a Richard the Lionheart month. That's why I'm waiting and I'm kind of unsure. So stay tuned for those. The Mongol episode is going to be a banger as well as some other fun ones. May have a special one for the holidays. In a very cool first for the show, this episode is sponsored by Cards of History. You can see, if you're watching on YouTube, I have here the Roman Empire collection, the purple box. You may have seen it back on the bookshelf on other episodes. And as I open this up real quick, let me just say that I take this sort of thing very seriously. In my history content, I've said many times, I feel a very strong responsibility toward being factual, a responsibility to the history. And along with that, of course, comes my responsibility to the people who are enjoying my content. It's my responsibility to portray things accurately to you. And so I'm not going to be accepting any sponsorships or anything like that I don't believe in. So I think this is a really great product. I was really surprised, actually, when I got the cards. They're very thick. It's made out of a quality material. It's got the gold edges on the sides of the cards. The cards are just really high quality, well made. And it goes over a variety of people, events, and various other historical, like one here on the Roman legionaries. And it's got some artwork that accompanies it. And then on the back of the card, it lists a handful of facts, like the origins and evolutions, training and discipline, equipment and armament, structure and organization, campaigns and battles. It's obviously a very brief summary, but it's a really great introduction into the Roman Empire, into that world. It'll give you little snapshots, little tastes here and there. Here's the Arch of Titus. Seneca. Not going to say his whole name. The Council of Nicaea. The Pyramids of Cestius. A whole variety of cards. It's got 36 cards. They're really high quality. They've got little facts on the back. And it's just a great way to get a little snapshot. If you have somebody who's curious about Roman history or the other periods of history for the cards that he's got, if you've got somebody who's curious about that or who's into it, it would make a great gift for this upcoming holiday season. And I think the product is really great. He puts a lot of time and effort into making a really fantastic design, something that feels really good, that feels like a great product, and is just a great introduction into the history. So you could check that out in the description. And for everybody on YouTube, I've made a huge mistake and I apologize. When I was recording, I somehow, prior to recording, clicked the button to toggle off the video recording. So I recorded the audio of our conversation and not the video. My apologies. You'll just have to listen. But it was a great conversation, so you should still enjoy anyway. If you would like more medieval content in your life, you can follow my X account. You can follow my Substack. You will find the links to those below. And without further ado, let's jump into the conversation about the medieval women who ruled the world. In your book, which has just been released, Women Who Ruled the World, you mentioned that there's essentially two qualifications for how you narrow down the women that you discuss in the book, the various rulers. So maybe you could run us through that real quickly so we have a little bit of a frame for the discussion of the various women we'll be talking about today.
Of course, yes. So, I mean, there have always been powerful women, queen consorts who are married to the king, regents, sisters of kings can often be very powerful. But I wanted particularly to look at women who are, effectively the face on the coin. They're the ones that don't have a man to hide behind. They're the power in their own right. So I kind of had a two-part definition for that. Firstly, you had to be royal because, it is about queenship. You don't have to be born royal, so you can marry into a royal family, but you have to have a conception that you're royal. And the second one, and which I would say is the most important part of the definition, is you have to be the head of state. And obviously, that's a bit anachronistic for some of the earlier cultures potentially, but you can normally kind of work out who's the head of state. So those, I think, are important because actually it's really rare for women to be heads of state. So these women are really essential to look at.
All right, so maybe we can start by discussing a few of the examples that are maybe a little bit further afield, and then we'll work our way into Europe. I believe you have here in the medieval period, there's 8 empresses of Japan, and then there's Wu. I'm not going to even try to pronounce that.
Deshin.
Zeshin. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so actually only 6 of the Japanese empresses are medieval, so but they have 8 reigning ones. 2 a bit later.
Oh, okay. Well, why don't we start with them? You could tell us about what's interesting, I guess, about or notable, I guess, about the 6.
Okay, so Japan, most people actually don't really realize this with Japan because women are barred from the throne today and have been since the 19th century. But actually, Japan's had 8 reigning empresses and 6 of them are in the medieval period. They begin with Suiko in the 6th century, who actually reigns for 35 years, which is a really significant reign length for the 6th century. And actually, she's the first person who uses the title Tenno, which is the title for emperor. The emperor of Japan is still called Tenno today. So she's really significant. Her name, all of the names that Japanese empresses and emperors use after their death are posthumous names. So her posthumous name, Suiko, means, sort of translator of literature or, sort of person who's interested in literature. And it's because she's actually, she promotes Japanese literature for the first time in her reign. So it's the first time we get really works written in Japanese rather than Chinese. She's really significant. And actually, there's a period for a couple of 100 years after Suiko where actually half the emperors are female, which is really unheard of. And some of them are very important. Some of them are less important. Empress Jito is very important. We also have a mother and a daughter who succeed each other, which is the only example of female to female succession. So Gensho and Genmai. And we also have the last of these medieval empresses who actually abdicates, is kind of pressured to abdicate, then manages to build up a party and comes back and actually has a different regnal name when she comes back. So she's Empress Kokken in her first reign and Empress Shotoku in her second reign. So these women are really significant. And what's really interesting about them is today people tend to call them regents or say they're only kind of keeping the throne warm for a male monarch. And they look at the fact that some of them abdicated, but actually male monarchs in Japan abdicate a lot as well. It's very, very common. In fact, Empress Kokken's father abdicates so that she can be empress. So they're clearly not placeholders. They're clearly independent sovereigns. Actually, the Far East is quite rich in medieval female monarchs. China has a reigning empress, which isn't that appreciated usually. It's just only one reigning empress, and that's Wu Zetian, who is empress in the 8th century. And she is absolutely fascinating. She's the daughter of a lumber merchant and rises to become emperor of China. And actually takes the throne when she's 70 years old. She compels one of her sons to abdicate. She's been married to a previous emperor, and is really the power behind the throne. And she has quite a bloodthirsty reputation. She sort of clears her way through the emperor's other wives to become his chief wife. His senior empress and his first concubine, she actually has their hands and feet cut off and puts them in vats of wine to die over several days. So she's kind of, she's a tough woman. But it's a fascinating period. And also in Korea, actually, we have the Queens of Silla. There are a couple of medieval examples there as well. So queenship is really global. It's not just European.
Is Wu Zetian, is she the one who I've heard the various stories about I believe it's the Chinese empress that has the giant pirate fleet or something like this with a huge army and is sailing around doing stuff. Is that her?
No, that's not her. So I think that's a consort. I mean, Wu has her own sort of dark legend. She's very good at propaganda, and actually, particularly Buddhist propaganda. Actually, she found this wonderful text that implied that the Buddha was going to come back in his final incarnation as a woman, and she had that sent around, sort of saying, this is probably me. And then, I mean, for centuries, people assumed she'd created this document, and that she'd made it up. And actually, then an older copy was found in the 1970s in a cave in India, I think. So it showed that actually she just found it and used it. But she's really good at propaganda like that. I mean, basically, her son kind of begs her to take the throne in the end because she's so kind of promoting herself as almost a goddess-like figure.
And she started at 70 years old? How long did she reign for?
15 years. So it's not a terribly long reign, but she starts her own dynasty. So it's in the middle of the Tang dynasty, but she starts her own Zhao dynasty, changes the imperial colors and things like that. She actually changes some of the characters used in Chinese writing, actually. She's quite an active empress, but it's, most people would be settling down to retirement at that age, but she decides she wants to be emperor of China.
70 years old. It's not too late for me. All right. So, and then you mentioned, we'll get a little bit closer here, Tamar of Georgia.
Yes. So Tamar's one of my favorites, actually. She's a really good example of what these women are up against. She reigns she's crowned in her father's lifetime as a junior king. So she's crowned as king rather than queen. And he does that to try to ensure that there'll be a smooth succession. He dies in 1184. And while her nobility had been saying to her father, who's quite a severe figure, quite scary, oh yeah, we'll definitely accept Tamar as ruler. As soon as she becomes queen, there's a lot of concern about having a reigning queen. I mean, Georgia's quite a militaristic society in the 12th century, of course, knightly culture, things like that. And she really, really struggles. She has a really difficult apprenticeship as queen. She struggles to impose her authority. She's unable to change her ministers. She's forced to take some ministers back that she doesn't like. She actually has what I kind of call a Magna Carta moment. So actually, before the English Magna Carta, actually, Tamar's nobles tried to impose something similar on her, effectively creating a parliament and taking away her power. She actually said that it would be the end of her rule if it went through. So she manages to see that off to some extent, but definitely loses a lot of power. And she's actually forced to marry this slightly random Russian prince that they send for that nobody really knows who he is. And it only takes her a really long time to secure her position. Eventually, she is able to change her own ministers. She's able to divorce her husband and send him back to Russia. And she kind of slowly builds herself up until actually today she's remembered as Georgia's greatest ruler. She's on their postage stamps. She's on their banknotes. They have this myth that she's actually not dead. She's sleeping in a cave, and one day she'll rise again to become Queen of Georgia once more. So she has this legend about her that kind of took a long time to build up. And I think that's so common with the position of reigning queens, is that everything that's given to them tends to be given to them quite grudgingly. People don't really want reigning queens. And then when they do, they try to take advantage of them. And so actually she does become powerful. And many queens don't, but she does. But actually she's so representative of what queens are up against.
Why do you think many people don't want reigning queens?
So I'd say we're a patriarchal species. I mean, I think that's a given. Almost every society around the world is patriarchal. Even matriarchies often have men in power. It's just that they pass power through the female line. So a man is succeeded by his sister's son, for example. In my research on global queenship, I only came upon two societies that I would call queendoms. One is in Kush, which is in Sudan and northern Ethiopia in the classical period, so through the Roman period. And they have a whole row of reigning Candaces, which is their word for queen, effectively. It's where the personal name Candice comes from. And they have queen after queen after queen, and they clearly are seeking out female rule. The other one is the reign queens of the Balabado in South Africa, and that's actually still going. It's recognized as a queendom in South Africa, so it's a subnational queendom. But actually, they're trying to crown a king at the moment. So even a queendom is looking like it may get a king. Otherwise, most states across the world and across time don't want a female ruler, and they tend to exhaust all the male rulers until they get to women. Most states will take a woman if it means the end of the dynasty. Otherwise, there are some that won't. France, for example, never had a female ruler. But most nations will take a female if it's otherwise the end of the dynasty, like the Tudors, for example, in England with Mary I and Elizabeth I. There weren't any men in the dynasty. But it's a case all the way up to sort of 1950s. Margareta of Denmark, who became queen in 1972, they had to change the law. She didn't have any claim to the throne until they changed the law because women were just barred from the succession. So I think it's a global thing. Women tend to not be welcomed, but they will grudgingly be accepted mostly.
Sort of the story that you're telling about Tamar of Georgia made me think of, I think it's Isabelle. No, I forget the name. Philip Augustus's first wife, who he kind of like tried to get rid of, but then she like fought and fought and fought and wrote all these letters to the Pope and fought and then eventually was sort of restored. It kind of has like a similar vibe to me.
Yeah, really similar. So I think it's Isabel of Hainault, isn't it? His Philip's first wife, I think so. But yeah, very similar. Women often have to fight for more. Someone actually said to me, there's this great quote that's attributed to Ginger Rogers, which is that she does everything a man does, but she has to dance doing it backwards and in high heels. And I think that actually applies to the queens quite well. They're trying to do everything that a man does, but they've got these extra impediments. Even like Maria Theresa, the Habsburg heiress, who succeeds in 1740, that starts the War of the Austrian Succession, even though she's legally the heir to the throne. Had she been a man, there would have been no war. She simply would have inherited everything. And you see that just, all the way through history.
So you mentioned no Queen of France, and I believe you mentioned Jean of France came the closest.
Yes. So France is actually somewhat unusual in that they will never accept a reigning queen. And they do have a chance where they could have done. So in 1316, Louis X died, and his only surviving legitimate child was his daughter Jean, who was a 4-year-old, so pretty tiny. And she simply got stepped over. His brother became king. And then another brother became king after him. And then the male line of the House of Capet was extinct. They had no male line before that. It had passed through the male line. And so they picked a cousin in the male line rather than Jean. And there was never any reason given for Jean's exclusion at the time. They simply just didn't want a queen. They let her be Queen of Navarre, which Louis had inherited from his mother. So she was given kind of almost a consolation kingdom, but she wasn't allowed to be Queen of France. About sort of 80 or so years later, obviously this kind of also kickstarted the 100 Years' War, of course, because Jean's cousin was Edward III of England through her aunt Isabella, and he also claimed the throne and was excluded. But actually about 80 or so years later, the French came up with this really dusty law called the Salic Law, which is quite famous to people interested in medieval history. It's a 6th century law drafted by King Clovis, and it doesn't really deal with female succession. It's, actually a bit of a random one that they came up with. It deals with sort of a lot of contemporary concerns. So it deals with, one of its big provisions is about the theft of bees, which is apparently an issue in the 6th century, according to the Salic Law. It does deal with inheritance, but it actually says women can inherit. So it basically goes through inheritance, says, it goes to your son, then it can go to your daughters. It says, except for the Salian lands, which only pass in the male line. So it's on that basis that the Salic Law was invented. No one's quite sure what the Salian lands are, but the Salic Law definitely didn't apply to the whole of France. It's got nothing to do with the crown of France. It probably only applies to a small portion of France. And not necessarily all the lands anyway, because what are the Salian lands? But on that basis, they created almost a myth of the Salic law with this kind of dubious historical backing. And it just, people ran with it. I mean, it's not just France that had the Salic law. Other countries also adopted the Salic law, and notably the Netherlands, actually, until the 20th century, they had the semi-Salic system of inheritance, which is you go through all the men in the dynasty before you'll have women. So when Wilhelmina became Queen of the Netherlands in 1890, when she was 10, it was only because every other male in the royal line had died, including their cousins, uncles, brothers. Everyone had died out, and that was the only reason. But people loved the Salic law because it gave a legal basis to excluding women, but actually it doesn't when you read the law.
Did you say the theft of bees, like
Yeah,
honeybees?
theft of bees. It's one of, it comes higher than the inheritance provisions in the law code. It's clearly a thing. It's an issue. I mean, I wouldn't want to steal any bees. I think I'd get stung.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm not sure how that works. I've
No.
heard of the Salic law before, and I'd actually love to do a deep dive podcast on that and how that affected time. If you know somebody who's an expert, because that's
Yeah,
that's that's all
yeah,
very interesting. That I'm like totally unfamiliar with.
yeah. No, I was fascinated when I actually read it. So I was looking at it going, this isn't about women at all. And actually, it says women can inherit. It's just
Huh.
one small group of lands.
So they
It's
just
hilarious.
so they just basically took this old Salic law and just sort of shoehorned this one bit about the Salic lands, and then sort of said, actually, it's all Salic lands, sort of.
Yes. Yeah, that's basically what they did. And I think because it was so old, it gave it extra authority. So they could say, for 1,000 years, this has been the case. But it wasn't, and it doesn't apply to the Kingdom of France. And women almost certainly could inherit the Kingdom of France. It's just that they didn't want a queen. But Jean's the person who comes closest to being Queen of France.
Do you think that situation would have been a little different if she had been older? Like if she'd have been 24 instead of 4?
Yeah, if she'd had a very powerful husband and been older, she might well have been able to take the throne. I mean, Jean's slightly complicated by the fact her mother had been imprisoned for adultery, which sort of meant that people could suggest that she wasn't legitimate, although her father never questioned it, and she was allowed to inherit the Kingdom of Navarre without any trouble. But I think, yeah, had she been older, I mean, the fact that actually there was a party saying this 4-year-old should be Queen of France at all does demonstrate that people weren't certain that she should be stepped over, because there was a group, and not a huge group, but there were a group of the nobility in France saying actually Jean should be queen.
Yeah, that story kind of reminds me a little bit of, I think it's Edward V, at the end of the Plantagenet era there, where all of a sudden there's the story of the illegitimate marriage or whatever is the deal, and then, oh well, actually, we're going to put these kids in the tower, and I guess Richard has to be king. It kind of reminds me of
Yeah,
something like that.
it is quite similar. I mean, being a child monarch was difficult anyway. They often get stepped over. People don't like them, and particularly if they're girls, that's always a bit of a disaster, because actually it's expected that a girl would move to a different country to get married. So you risk losing your monarch, of course, if you have a child queen. But yeah, I mean, it is quite a similar situation. Had she been older, perhaps she could have held the French throne, and then we wouldn't have a Salic law at all.
Oh, yeah, I guess very interesting, right? Because then, that would have prevented, I suppose, the use of that. She sort of set the precedent, I suppose, if you will, for legitimizing the reuse of the Selic law.
Yeah, yeah. So they basically use it as a concept to retrospectively justify why she was excluded. And because there was the fact of her exclusion as well, people are like, yeah, that's fine. She was excluded. This is why.
Yeah, the child monarch is definitely a very difficult thing. I think about, I'm a big fan of the Hautevilles, the, Normans in Italy, and there's a period where after Humphrey dies, after the Battle of Civitate, and, his Robert Guiscard sort of, like, takes guardianship of his kids, and they're supposed to become the Dukes of Calabria and Apulia, and then you just never hear about them again. So,
Yeah,
who knows?
yeah.
They could have just, fell on some rocks or something. Nobody knows, but it doesn't seem like it went well for them.
Yeah, it was dangerous being a child monarch. I mean, the classic example is Mary Queen of Scots, who's 6 days old when she becomes queen in 1542, and her childhood's awful. Her early childhood, with everyone trying to fight over who gets possession of her. But you get other examples in the medieval period. Some of the queens of Jerusalem, the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, are child monarchs, and their lives are fairly grim. Particularly Isabella II, who becomes queen when she's born because her mother dies in childbirth, and is just a pawn, really. eventually gets removed from the kingdom when she marries someone because she doesn't even need her there, and dies in childbirth when she's about 16.
Maybe you could tell me a little bit about Mary, Queen of Scots. I know she's a little bit after the medieval period, but I've heard a lot about her because I recorded this audiobook on dueling stories of the 16th century, and they're talking a lot in there about accompanying Mary, Queen of Scots here and there, and she pops up at various times in the book, and it's very interesting. But I'm not really familiar with her at all.
Yeah, so she's fascinating. So she becomes queen at 6 days old when her father dies in December 1542. She's the Scots have had a queen before, a child queen, in fact, Margaret, but she died when she was a very small, on her way to Scotland, actually. So they hadn't really had experience of a child monarch. So there's a lot of kind of debate about what they do with her. I mean, she's the first woman to be crowned as reigning queen in the British Isles, which is interesting, although they must have had to sort of hold the crown over her because she was only a few months old. But there's a lot of arguing over her regency. Henry VIII gets involved. He's her great uncle, and he's determined that she's going to marry his son Edward. And he actually invades Scotland to try to ensure that that happens, because he wants to raise Mary in England to unite the kingdoms. It's called the Rough Wooing, where the Scots end up, the English end up burning Edinburgh, for example. And eventually, when Mary's 6, she's sent to France to get her away from the English. And she's raised in France. She's engaged to the Dauphin, so the heir to the throne, who eventually becomes Francis II. And she becomes, effectively a French woman. She misses the Reformation, which is a problem. So she remains Catholic, very ardently Catholic, where in Scotland they become very Presbyterian, of course. She marries Francis. He then dies, and she returns home to Scotland in 1560. And she'd never been expected to rule her kingdom at all directly. It was always assumed that she would have regents and she'd live in France. So she's a bit of an unknown quantity. And she initially does quite well. It is quite problematic for her. Whenever she tries to hear mass, people attack her priests and things like that. She comes up against John Knox, who's the founder of the Church of Scotland, who is a bit of a nightmare, really. He'd written a book called The Trumpet Blast Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women, which is about all the female rulers in the British Isles and about how unnatural it is to have a female ruler. She's really unlucky. She marries Henry Lord Darnley, who's her cousin, has a claim to the English throne as well, because Mary always has her eye on the English throne. After Elizabeth, she's probably next in line. On the family tree, she definitely is. And then after her, the next in line is Henry Lord Darnley, who's her cousin. So she marries him. He's an absolute disaster. He murders her secretary while the secretary's actually clinging onto her dresses at one point. She gives birth to her son, James. And then not long after James is born, there's an explosion in Edinburgh at the house that Darnley is staying in, and he's found strangled in the gardens after his house is blown up. So people think Mary did it. She probably didn't, but she doesn't help herself by marrying the Earl of Bothwell, who probably did murder Darnley soon afterwards. Bothwell had kidnapped her and raped her, which is why she had to marry him in the period. It was required, really. It's horrific, but it was required that you married your rapist. So she kind of had to, but it means that she loses her throne. She's forced to abdicate in 1567. She's in prison. She escapes from prison and then flees to England. Actually, Bothwell gets his comeuppance at least, because he flees to Norway. And he lands in Norway, and this woman comes up to him and goes, "You're my husband, you abandoned me." And it's his first wife who reports him to the authorities, and he spends the rest of his life chained to a pillar in a castle in Norway. I think it might be in Denmark, actually. You can still see the groove in the floor where he walked around the pillar. So he does get his comeuppance. So Mary is imprisoned in England from 1568. Elizabeth I will never see her. So she's moved around various residences in the north and in the Midlands, and she's involved in plots against Elizabeth, and eventually she's tried for treason and executed in 1587. So it's a really sad story. It's interesting because obviously she's kind of the rival of another reigning queen, which you hardly ever see in sort of medieval or early modern period. It's rare to have kind of two queens interacting in that way. But she's kind of the unsuccessful one, whereas Elizabeth, of course, is much more successful.
What a wild life. She's just all over the place.
Yeah, it's a really sad life. It's a wasted life. And kind of almost the worst thing for her is she knows that had Elizabeth died, at any point that she was imprisoned in England, she would have become Queen of England, most likely. People would have just released her and put her on the throne because she's next in line. So you can see why she is trying to kill Elizabeth, and she does agree that in the Babington plots, which she's involved in, she agrees that Elizabeth should be murdered, which leads to Mary's own execution. But you can sort of see why you might consider murdering Elizabeth if she locks you up for nearly 20 years.
Definitely understandable. I think one that many people are probably familiar with is Empress Matilda, and she had kind of a rough time as well.
Yeah, so Matilda's one of my favorites. She's in the chapter of the book that looks at women who are kind of denied the title of queen, even though they're clearly monarchs. And she generally doesn't get included on king lists in Britain. It's getting a bit better, but she should be. She is the only surviving legitimate child of Henry I, and he has, who's the son of William the Conqueror, and he has his barons swear that Matilda will be his heir after his death. And they all say, "Yep, we'll swear, that's fine." But when he dies in 1135, her cousin Stephen rushes over to England and claims the throne, has himself crowned. And so Matilda's kind of stuck. She's in Normandy. Her husband starts to invade Normandy on her behalf, but she hasn't really got any party in England to go over and claim the throne. Eventually, in 1139, her half brother, so her father's illegitimate son, who couldn't claim the throne because he's illegitimate, comes over and says, I'll support you, come to England. So she does. And it starts a civil war, effectively. It's Victorians called it the Anarchy, which is kind of an apt name for the period. Matilda rules in the west, Stephen rules in the east of the kingdom, and actually they're both kind of rulers. In many respects, it should be called the Stephen and Matilda period, really. In 1141, she captures Stephen at the Battle of Lincoln, and she has him chained in her dungeon. So she goes to London for her coronation. And while she's waiting for the coronation, she's at dinner one evening when the Londoners drive her out of the city. And so she comes really, really close to being crowned, but doesn't quite manage it. She's been declared Lady of the English earlier in 1141, which effectively means queen. And people do call her queen as well. But she never secures the coronation. And not long afterwards, she's forced to release Stephen when her half-brother is captured by his supporters. So they do a prisoner exchange. And she never comes quite as close to the throne again, although she keeps up the struggle. And eventually her son succeeds Stephen. But actually, I think, she's pretty clearly the monarch in 1141. And I think what's quite interesting about Matilda is how she's portrayed. Even writers today will say she loses the crown because she's arrogant. A contemporary source said that it's because she frowned a lot. That she would have her supporters come to her on bended knee and that she would kind of give her own counsel. She wouldn't necessarily take advice. But these are all qualities that were expected of a ruler. I mean, you would expect a ruler to have people bowing to them. That's what people do with kings. So actually, I don't think William the Conqueror would be, criticized for frowning at people, for example, or people would think he had to lose his throne. So I think, there are real double standards. It's quite difficult in the period to marry being a woman with being a king because the two kind of don't fit. And that's something Matilda really comes up against. It's a real struggle for her to impose herself, with everyone going, well, that's not very womanly. But obviously, if she was acting like a traditional woman in the period, then that wouldn't be very kingly.
So I'm thinking about like Procopius, and how he obviously wrote like the serious histories of Belisarius, sort of the histories of his conquests and military campaigns and such. And then he had the secret histories. And I think, as I understand it, the secret histories is kind of understood as kind of like he's being a silly goose here. Um, is that, when the chroniclers are writing things like this, like, well, she lost her crown because she frowned a lot. Is that just kind of, are they being like silly gooses, or like what, that's not really serious, right?
I think it is serious. Yeah, and people still follow it. You'll find books written by historians in the last 20 years or so. Not everyone by any means, but who sort of say it's because she's arrogant. She has an enduring reputation for arrogance. So they are being serious. It's particularly the making her supporters bow to her. That's, people have a real problem with that because you shouldn't be bowing to women. But yeah, no, they are taking it seriously. It's very much counts against her. Equally, Stephen is criticized for being too weak. For example, he takes a hostage, a child hostage, and then when that hostage's parents kind of renege on their agreement with the king, he then doesn't kill the hostage, and so he gets criticized for that, for being kind. But Matilda gets criticized for being arrogant. So there's such a strict gender imbalance. What's really interesting with Matilda is if she was doing it through a man, it wouldn't be a problem. So Stephen's queen, who unhelpfully is also called Matilda, raises an army, is very active politically, but because she's doing it for her husband and for her son, that's the acceptable face of female power. People are fine with that because she's not doing it for herself. So that's the difference, really, is, you can be a powerful woman in the period, but you have to do it through a man. And the fact that Matilda tries to do it without a man, because her husband, Geoffrey, who she doesn't like, doesn't come to England. She's not trying to crown Geoffrey. She wants to be crowned herself.
I'm glad you mentioned the unhelpfulness of Stephen's wife also being Matilda, because that
Yes.
really irks me a lot when I hear it.
It's
I'm
so
not an expert
annoying.
in this period, so it really bothers me.
Yeah, but it annoys me also when people call Matilda Maud, because she was never called Maud at the time. It's a later, it's a version of Matilda. But why do we take her name away? We don't call her son Henry Hal, for example, because there are loads of Henrys. Actually, we should be calling her Matilda. That's her name, and you kind of just have to make it work with the fact that they're all called Matilda, which is hard.
It's really troublesome for people like me who are not experts hearing the story, because I always am like, wait, which Matilda are we talking about here?
Yeah, it's really hard. And when you get to the 16th century, they're all called Elizabeth and Thomas, and that gets really hard as well.
Why do you think that after pledging loyalty to her, there became the whole anarchy situation, that people went back on that or whatever? Because if I recall, wasn't there kind of something similar with actually William the Conqueror, where his father left, had everybody pledged to him, and then there was a long period where he was facing like assassinations and sort of all of this division and stuff. Is that sort of just like are Normans just a little bit, they're just a little bit wild, or like what's the deal there?
So Normans are good at sniffing out weakness. So William the Conqueror, of course, was a child when his father died, and also illegitimate. He's called William the Bastard until he starts conquering. But yeah, so a child boy or a woman, they're both weaker. There's an opportunity to be had there potentially. I think also, to some extent, the oaths are taken under duress. When Henry I gets people to swear that they'll accept Matilda as his heir, actually Henry I is really scary. People are frightened of him. You're going to do it, because if you say, no, I don't want to support Matilda as heir, he'll probably have you killed. He has two of his own granddaughters blinded through an illegitimate life, so his illegitimate daughter's children. He's a scary man, Henry I. And so people agree, but actually I think they've almost got their fingers crossed behind their back. They're thinking, well, we're not really going to support a woman. Very few people are going to put their neck out for a woman. The fact that some people do is because they do have this Christian belief in the oaths. The oaths aren't supposed to be sacred. Breaking an oath is a big deal in the 12th century, as it was in the 11th. In fact, that was William's argument for invading England. He says that Harold had made an oath to him that he would support William as king, and that Harold had broken his oath. So that's how William gets the Pope's support behind the invasion of England. So, it was a big deal, but a woman is always going to be a weaker option in the 12th century as far as the contemporaries are concerned, the same as a child.
The other thing that confuses me about this is, how can Stephen just sort of show up and get crowned? Isn't there like can't they just be like, no, 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 like this not, that's not the order. Like how do you determine who's allowed to just sort of sneak in and get crowned? Where's the cutoff?
Yeah, so I think it did surprise people. It surprised his elder brother, who was actually offered Normandy by the rebel barons before they heard that Stephen had taken the throne. So Stephen had an elder brother. Stephen is a grandson of William the Conqueror through his mother Adela, so through a female line. I think he just chanced it and then persuaded them to crown him. The line of succession wasn't fixed at that point. So Henry I, for example, had taken the throne ahead of his elder brother Robert, and Robert also had a son, William Clito. So the line of succession wasn't that fixed, although the oaths should have made it fixed. So Matilda was heir because the oaths had been sworn effectively by all the leading barons. The Queen Dowager, she'd sworn, everybody had sworn. But yeah, the fact that Stephen was able to persuade him, I think it's because he's quite charming. He certainly didn't have a right to take the throne. But he was able to persuade him. I think he had a good enough claim, and he was there, and Matilda was in Normandy and a woman, that actually people went, yeah, that's probably fine.
Yeah, I think that's a good point you made about Normans being good at sniffing out weakness. I think that's like
Yes.
a common trait across time. I like to think about it as opportunism, but that's like maybe another good way of describing it. So tell me about Charlotte of Cyprus.
Yeah, so she's interesting. So Charlotte becomes Queen of Cyprus in the 1440s. She succeeds her father. She's his only surviving child. She secures a coronation, and she's then required to marry her cousin Louis of Savoy, who's a bit of a nightmare. They don't get on, and they immediately start vying for power. He calls himself King of Cyprus. She calls herself Queen of Cyprus. They mint separate coins with no reference to the other, so they don't get on. But in that mix, she's also got a much more dangerous male rival, and that is her half brother, Jacques, who is her father's illegitimate son. And it was quite clear he was going to be a problem. He's got no claim to the throne because he's illegitimate, but he is the son of the late king. Her father had made him an archbishop, the Archbishop of Nicosia, to try and kind of eliminate him as a rival. But then Jacques killed the royal chancellor and got thrown out of the church. So he was back in the secular world. So Jacques takes himself off to Cairo, to the Mamluk Sultan, who is the overlord for Cyprus. So Egypt had conquered Cyprus several decades before, and so have an overlord, a vassal relationship. And Jacques takes him off to the Sultan. And in Islam, you don't have the same concept of illegitimacy that you have in the Christian world. So to the Sultan, it's just a competition between the son and the daughter of the late king, which is no competition. Obviously the son. So the Sultan supports Jacques, sends him back with an Egyptian fleet, and there's a civil war. Charlotte takes herself off to the Pope to try to appeal direct to the Pope, because of course, the Pope will recognize legitimacy. She talks about her pseudo-Christian brother. She sort of implies that her brother is a friend of Islam rather than Christianity, for example. But actually the Pope, and we have a great account of the meeting because the Pope actually wrote his autobiography. And he talks about how attractive he finds Charlotte, which is not very popey, really. But he also talks about how the words come out in a torrent. She seems over emotional. And basically he says to her, well, I think you've lost Cyprus because your father-in-law was quite rude to me last time I met him. So he basically says that it's God's will that she loses Cyprus because her father-in-law was rude to the Pope. I mean, her father-in-law is not anything to do with Cyprus. He lives in Savoy. But it's just, she's such a good illustration for why having men in your life can be a real problem for reigning queens. Her father-in-law's a nightmare. The Pope's a nightmare. Her husband's a nightmare. And then her brother steals her kingdom. So she's a really interesting example. She never gets Cyprus back.
So maybe the last one we'll jump into here is Isabel of Castile, and then is it her daughter, Juana la Beltranea?
Beltranea. Yeah, that's her niece, actually.
Niece,
Yes,
okay.
so Isabel, I mean, she's famous, of course. She's Isabelle the Catholic, mother of Catherine of Aragon, one of the two Catholic kings of Spain. But actually, she had quite a dubious claim to the throne. So when her brother, Henry IV, who's known as Henry the Impotent, when he died, Isabel claimed the throne. She said, I'm heir to the throne. And she had herself crowned. And actually walked which caused a lot of comment. She walked in her coronation procession with a sword unsheathed before her, which shows that she was planning to fight for the crown, which is really unusual for a woman to do, and showed a lot it caused a lot of comment. But the reason she knew she'd have to fight for it was because Henry had left a 12-year-old daughter, Juana, who's known as Juana la Beltranea. The reason she's known as Juana la Beltranea is because there are rumors about her paternity. Quite a lot of them spread by Isabel. So Henry is known as the Impotent. His first marriage he had annulled on the grounds that he was impotent, which didn't help matters. But he then marries a Portuguese princess, and they eventually produce Juana. There are rumors actually they'd use artificial insemination to do so. The Pope had heard those rumors, using a golden vial and sort of some help for the king. But unsurprisingly, there were rumors about Juana's paternity. It's not helped by the fact that her mother later had a couple of illegitimate children that were acknowledged as illegitimate while Henry was alive. But actually, Henry never suggested Juana wasn't his daughter. He wanted her to succeed him. She probably was his daughter, although, we'll never know for sure. Her nickname comes from the man who was believed to be her father, Beltran, so La Beltranea, so the daughter of Beltran. But so Isabel vies for the throne with Juana. Juana is supported by the King of Portugal, who's her uncle, who marries her. And they have the War of the Castilian Succession. Eventually, Isabel wins and actually forces Juana to become a nun, and really then keeps an eye on her in her convent, keeps her in the convent, because Juana signs her name as Queen of Castile until her death. So it's an interesting one actually to have two potential queens vying for the throne. Isabel obviously becomes incredibly powerful. She's probably the second or third most powerful reigning queen in Europe at that time. The only real examples before her are Marguerite I of Denmark, and also Urraca of Castile, who was in the Norman period. Otherwise, there haven't been any really powerful women in Europe as reigning queens. So Isabel's interesting. She marries Ferdinand of Aragon, and they unite Spain, but actually she retains all of her power in Castile. So although she's a consort in Aragon, in Castile she's the ruler. Ferdinand has a lot of power too, but she retains her power. She obviously famously sponsored Christopher Columbus's voyage in 1492, which is why Spain ended up with such a lot of the New World. She also, she's very, very religious, hence her nickname, the Catholic. A lot of her policies are fairly distasteful to modern eyes and actually were to contemporaries to some extent. So she expels the Jewish community from Castile, and that was a very large community, but largely because Spain hadn't really had a big expulsion before, because a lot of medieval states expelled the Jewish communities. She also brings in the Spanish Inquisition, which obviously is not a good thing, and that disproportionately targets converso communities, who are communities of people who have converted either in their lifetime or often many generations back, who converted to Catholicism from Judaism. She also starts a war. She considers it to be a crusade, where she eventually conquers the last Muslim kingdom in Spain, the Kingdom of Granada, and drives the sultans out. So a lot of what she does at the time would have been viewed relatively positively, particularly driving the Muslim kingdom out of Spain. But, actually, so her reputation remains sort of today sort of fairly dubious to some extent, particularly her treatment of her Jewish subjects.
If I recall, there's a story of her hearing about the treatment of the American natives and being upset about that. Is that right? That was her?
Yeah. Yeah. So she actually, because she's so religious, she actually viewed the discovery of the New World and the fact there were so many people living there as a kind of almost God's given her these people to convert. So she almost sees herself in a kind of almost kind of Moses like position where she's been given all these souls to convert to Christianity. So she does have quite an ambiguous relationship with the Native American people, because obviously they're being hideously exploited by the Spaniards quite soon after the conquest. But actually, she adds a codicil to her will saying, treat them well. I want you to treat them well. It's not really being fed through in practice, but she certainly was concerned about the fate of her immortal soul if she doesn't treat the Native American people well, because she thinks they're there for her to convert, and that's why they're there and why they discovered it.
Oh, that's very interesting. So both Isabel and Juana are in a period, they're in a chapter in your book, pulling it up here, The Warrior Queens. Now,
Yes.
I'm I'm going, as we discussed just briefly prior to recording, this is something that is totally foreign to me. So I'm going to ask you a question from an uneducated point of view. I'm used to the sort of idea of, you could say maybe like 10th or 11th, 12th century of the boys going off when they're 6 to 8 years old, and then they basically train to be a knight, and that's how you become a warrior. So what do you mean by warrior queen? How are we defining this? Did they actually fight? Like I don't know.
Yeah. So I wanted to include this because actually it's quite a good way that women can sort of structure themselves as exceptional beings. Because actually that's one way to shore up your position on the throne, is to sort of say, I'm exceptional. Elizabeth the First, of course, famously, at Tilbury says, I may have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king. It's that kind of thing. So most of these women don't fight. So Isabel very much constructs herself as a war leader. She appears on battlefields. She's later depictions always show her on the battlefield. She's involved in logistics, she's involved in tactics, but she's not actually fighting. And most of these women don't, because of course they haven't had the training. In knightly culture, as you said, boys are training since they're young, and women don't have that. If you put Isabel in armor and gave her a sword, she'd be rubbish because she just hasn't had any training whatsoever. Occasionally they do. Kudzia Begum, who's a 19th century ruler in India of Bhopal, actually learns to ride an elephant and fire a gun when she becomes a ruler, so in case she has to go into battle. But in general, women don't fight, even women with kind of quite a martial reputation. Zenobia, who's a classical queen of Palmyra, who conquers Egypt. She also, in the 3rd century, she also doesn't fight herself. She commands but doesn't fight. So it is a different concept to men. But actually, women tend to get more visibility. The conquest of Granada, for example, all of the later paintings which show the conquest show Isabel on horseback amongst her army. They don't show Ferdinand, her husband, who's actually involved in the battles. In the War of the Castilian Succession, he commands the Castilian troops in the only pitched battle of the war, for example. But it's Isabel that the focus is on. So I think it is quite a propaganda thing for women. They often appear wearing breastplates and things. Is Elizabeth of Russia, when she takes the throne in the 18th century, puts on a breastplate. She's not really expecting to fight, but it's almost, it's a symbol. And they often will wear armor. They often appear on the battlefields, but they're not actually fighting.
Yeah, I think most famously Joan of Arc is probably in that category, right? And
Yeah,
there's also for the Normans, Robert Guiscard's wife Sigelgaita. She was wearing armor and on the battlefield. There seems to be some question as to whether she was fighting or not. But she was certainly rallying troops and boosting morale and running around and making sure that the cowards didn't fly away.
yeah. I mean, so there's definitely a role for women on the battlefield in the medieval period, potentially. Yeah, whether they're actually fighting, it's kind of, I just don't think they'd have the skill necessarily. But yeah, but there's certainly, there is a sense that women can be quite powerful icons in war, particularly fighting for a female leader, and particularly if they kind of, they appear with the troops. That's always quite popular.
I think the training is like the key point on that for me, because obviously the men are training, most of them are training from anywhere from 6 to 8 years old. So by the time you have a guy who's 25 on the battlefield, he's got almost 20 years of experience. That's actually what bothered me about Kingdom of Heaven is this story about the blacksmith who gets like one sword fighting lesson in the woods, and then all of a sudden he's taken on 3 Templar knights, 1 on 3. It's like,
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, there's just no way you'd have the skill. Hugely skilled, being a knight, just ridiculously skilled. There's no way you could do it. You've got to do the apprenticeship. So, which is why I'm pretty doubtful when I see stories about women in the thick of battle. They might fight a bit on the edges, but actually, I just can't see them having the skill to do a proper job, really. And it's just pointless. It's kind of almost, you're going out there just to die if you haven't got any skill.
well, and as you say, it doesn't mean that they don't play a role or even have an important part. Like the Battle of Dorylaeum, for example, it's mentioned that the women were bringing water to the front lines from the well for all the guys that were standing up on the line. So there's definitely important roles. I mean, you can't fight in the desert without water. So
No, absolutely. Logistics, they are there. They're definitely there. And I think that's worth bringing out. And, actually the idea of there are loads of female commanders, but actually the idea of the warrior queen, I think, is a really interesting one. And it gets a bit, you have to be careful. I mean, you get into the realm of video games to some extent. And, you have the kind of the barbarian queen and kind of wearing a breastplate bikini, which would be really pointless. But they do.
yeah, we don't have to go into the breastplate bikinis. So I have one of my subscribers on Substack has a question for you. Stephen, he asks why women rulers became more acceptable in the East Roman Empire sooner than in Western Europe.
Yeah, great question, Stephen. Yeah, so the first Western European ruler of any note, a female one, is probably Urraca, who rules in the 11th century in Castile and Leon. But in the Byzantine Empire, there aren't a few reigning females. I think partly it's the position of women in the Byzantine Empire, and they are really powerful. So you have some really powerful consorts like Theodora, the wife of Justinian, who is incredibly powerful. She's not a reigning monarch. She's comes quite close, but she's not the reigning monarch. But there are some reigning monarchs. So in my book, I bring in Irene, who is she's first of all a consort, then she's regent for her young son, and very influential in both positions. And then eventually has her son blinded and takes the throne herself, which looks really bad. And people very much damn Irene for this. Is all in the 8th century. People damn Irene for the fact that she blinded her own son, and it does look really bad. But in the context of Byzantium, it's kind of expected that you'll mutilate your rivals, and her own son had blinded his uncle at one stage. So, it does look bad, but it's, I think we probably shouldn't entirely judge her on that. We need to look at the cultural context. What is interesting, though, is that because she was Byzantine empress, the Pope actually went, oh, there isn't a Roman emperor, and crowned Charlemagne as the first, effectively Holy Roman Emperor in 800. And that was solely because the Byzantine Empire had a woman on the throne. So, yes, anyway, back to the question. It was a great question. I think partly it's to do with the attitude in Byzantium, why they're more inclined to have women. And basically, they have this kind of understanding that it's almost like the divine right of kings. So whoever is emperor must be emperor because God wants them to be emperor. And that's a real thing in Byzantine political culture, which means that they'll sometimes accept peasants as emperors and things like that. So basically, if you can become emperor, even if you're a woman or you're a peasant or you're someone really unsuitable, they'll assume it's that God wants you to be emperor. And so that's one way that women can rule. There are a few examples. In fact, at one stage, there were two sisters ruling as emperors, joint emperors of Byzantium. So really interesting. But I think it is to do with the culture. I think firstly, it's that women are more powerful in general. And I think secondly, it is the idea of this sort of divine right. So if you're on the throne, you must be there for a reason. And that really helps. Western Europe doesn't have many examples of powerful queens, really until the 15th century. There are a couple of exceptions to that.
It seems like also because of the East Roman method of succession, and there's lots of these queens or uh, previous mothers that are regents or consorts or sort of uh, dabbling in the succession process, if you will, through, as you mentioned, through blinding her own son, or, it seems like there's, you know, sort of becoming empress yourself is sort of like one step removed, whereas maybe in the West, women were not really, they weren't even that close, I guess, if it were. So it's like a much larger step. Does that seem like reasonable?
Yeah, I think that is quite reasonable. You're right. I mean, women are very involved in the political process in Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, whereas they're not so much in Western Europe. They're more the exceptions. Mostly women are kind of kept a bit further away from power. They're not necessarily the movers and shakers. There are exceptions to that. Matilda of Flanders rules as regent on behalf of William the Conqueror a lot. And Matilda of Scotland, the same, the first wife of Henry I. But yeah, in general, I think there's less of an acceptance for women having a formal role in Western Europe.
Seems like with the Frankish custom of killing your own relatives, her and Charlemagne would have gotten on pretty well.
Yeah, well, actually, there was talk of them getting married so that they could combine the Western and the Eastern Empire. They were talking about it, but it wasn't to be. She eventually got deposed by a peasant.
That's rough. So one of the things that I also saw that you mentioned in the book is, I forget who it was. Somebody styled themselves after Zenobia, sort of as like a model queen. And I was wondering if any other queens did that, because I know that there are some kings who did that. Actually, Charlemagne sort of famously styled himself after King David. Was that like a common thing amongst women rulers, or was that like an exception?
It's mostly an exception in that there aren't that many positive examples that at least earlier queens would be aware of. By the 19th century, it's different. They're all basing themselves on Victoria, sometimes really explicitly so. But actually, in the earlier period, there aren't that many examples they'd necessarily be aware of that are positive. So they're absolutely aware of Cleopatra, for example. They're absolutely aware of Attalia, who's the only biblical reigning queen. She's the queen of Judah about 3,000 years ago, who comes to a bad end. She tries to bring in other gods and eventually gets murdered by her temple staff. So they're aware of these negative examples, but they're not so aware of the positive examples. I mean, Elizabeth I would know about Isabelle of Castile, for example. But actually, in my book, I actually have a chapter where I look at particularly at Mary, Queen of Scots, and how she is compared to Cleopatra and how she's compared to Attalia and how they're actually used as justifications for her to be executed. So the English Parliament is saying, well, Attalia and also Jezebel, who's a consort, but Queen Jezebel is probably Attalia's mother in the Bible. So they very much use these examples, these negative examples, to attack women rulers, but they're not so aware of the positive examples. And there hadn't been that many that they necessarily would be aware of. Zenobia is fairly obscure. She's in the Canterbury Tales, so they do know about her, but she has a somewhat ambiguous reputation. But yeah, they don't have that many positive examples, basically.
It seems like a lot of the rulers that we're discussing, a big part of their reign is really just fighting for power, fighting to essentially exert their own rights. Maybe Isabel of Castile is kind of a rare example of actually being able to rule and govern somewhat effectively. Is that a fair characterization then of looking at these various rulers, or were there other ones that were successful, or was it mostly a lot of their reign was taken up with essentially like the struggle to exert their own rights?
Yeah, so more reigning queens fail than succeed, and that was something I was really struck by. And I think there's still a strength in the attempt to do it, because every time a nation comes close to having a female head of state, or does for a bit, I think that's quite important. But there are some really positive examples. Marguerite the First of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden is a really good example. She's 14th and early 15th century, and she's incredibly powerful. Before Isabel, she's undoubtedly the most powerful woman that Europe has ever seen. I mean, she conquers Sweden, which is embarrassing for the King of Sweden, because he's been conquered by a woman, and that's mentioned quite a lot to him. But yeah, so she's incredibly powerful. And a really effective administrator as well. I mean, we have her ordinances for herring markets, for example, where she even she deals with the minutiae. She even tells people how much shopkeepers can sell for wine and things like that, so people don't get too drunk at her herring markets and things like that. But she's a really powerful example of a reigning queen. So there are some really powerful examples. Zenobia is successful until she isn't. Cleopatra's successful until she isn't as well. So yeah, I mean, a lot of them do fail, or a lot of them have a difficult time of it and then succeed, like Tamar. But there are some examples that are just stupendously successful, like Marguerite, like Isabel, like Elizabeth I of England. So there are some examples as well of queens that do really, really well.
And so I think I have one last question for you, and then I'll leave you with the final word. And I'm gonna explain this all, and then I'll let you have at it. Because in thinking about this, and reading the intro to your book, and the conclusion, so there's let me think of the right way to phrase this. It seems to me like some of the struggle, and I'm speaking only of the medieval period. It seems to me like some of the struggle that women rulers had is because they essentially just that they weren't warriors. And so when I look at it, like, there's various kings like William the Conqueror or Richard the Lionheart, and they obviously were very strong warriors, and so they had, although they were brutal, they were effective at sort of imposing their will. Even more sort of scholarly or administrative rulers like Charlemagne or Alfred or Philip Augustus, even though they were, I think they're considered more administrative, and certainly in the case of Alfred or Charlemagne, more scholarly. But even Alfred fought on the front line. Charlemagne is apparently recorded as having been in on the front lines in at least two battles. Philip went on the Third Crusade and fought at Bouvines. But then I look at other male rulers like King John or Henry VI, or even like Edward the Confessor. There was obviously he was sort of bullied by Godwin, and then there's obviously the debacle of the succession afterwards. So it seems like these kings, even if they're male kings that are less warrior like, really struggle despite not being women. Is that kind of a fair understanding of that? That maybe some of that is just due to their sort of inability to be a warrior themselves, or is that not a fair characteristic or understanding of that?
I think it's variable. I mean, there are definitely examples of reigning kings who are successful and not warriors. Edgar, for example, who reigns in the 10th century in England and is Edward the Confessor's grandfather. Um, he's called Edgar the Peaceable. And partly because he doesn't really have anyone to fight during his reign. But actually, the fact that he's not exactly, known for his battle skill doesn't seem to have affected him at all. So I think it is variable. Yeah, a part of being a monarch in the medieval period, at least in the sort of earlier end of the medieval period, is that you should be reigning. Sorry. Part of being a monarch in the medieval period is that you should be a warrior. That's part of the role of a monarch. And it is difficult when women can't do that because they're not trained to do it. But I think it does go deeper than that. And I think there's, a clear disinclination to have a female ruler that goes beyond simply military culture. And it's, there's no female Roman emperors, for example. It's a long-standing thing. there's a disinclination for women to be powerful, and I think that's worth bearing in mind. So yeah, the warrior thing is part of it, but I think it's just another facet of a woman not being wanted. And Matilda, again, Matilda's not a warrior, but she does capture Stephen in battle, but there's still upset about her being monarch. So yes and no, I would say, is the answer to the question. But I think that even were a woman to present as a fully trained warrior, she would still struggle to become queen.
I guess that's a little bait and switch because you just brought up another question then. You just mentioned that there was no female emperors in the Roman Empire. So how did
Yes.
that transition then from there being no female empresses into the Eastern Roman, the Byzantines, them sort of having that culture, I guess, of acceptable female participation in the political process?
Yeah, so it's female. I mean, women can be quite powerful in the Roman Empire. Women are supposed to not be powerful I'm talking kind of about the classical period rather than sort of post, the split. But women can be quite powerful. They're supposed to not be powerful, but they often are. Elagabalus's mother and grandmother put him on the throne, for example, and then they have him removed in favor of a cousin. So there can be some really powerful figures. They're not able to reign in their own right, though. Elagabalus's grandmother doesn't decide she's going to be empress. So you do get a switch when it becomes the Eastern Roman Empire, when it becomes a Byzantine Empire. But even there, they've only got a handful of reigning empresses. It's only 3. In the whole period. They've got some very powerful consorts. They've got some very powerful queen emperor mothers and things like that. But, it's still rare to have women. But I think, there's clearly a disinclination to have women worldwide. Even if you presented as the eldest child of the king and in anywhere and, in the medieval period, and you're fully trained in war, if you've got a younger brother, they're not going to make you queen, for example, even if you're really competent. Or, if you've got a male cousin, you're probably most likely not going to become queen, even if you're really competent. And I think that is worth bringing out, that it is not simply just, lacking one element of the definition of king. The main element that women are lacking is the fact they're female. So they're lacking maleness.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining me for the discussion today. And if anyone would like to check your book out, it will be in the description. You can find the link for that there. And I will leave you with the final word. If you have anything else to say about women who ruled the world, female rulers, emperors, empresses, kings, queens.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure to be on the show. And I hope that I've got everyone sort of thinking about reigning queenship or female kings. And I think what's important to note is they are quite rare, but they're always there. Somewhere in the world, there's always a reigning queen in the medieval period or a female king. And so it is worth studying it. And also, if you want to look at female power in their own right, there is still, only about 10% of the world's presidencies today are occupied by women. So if you want, and actually the first woman to be elected directly as a president was only 1980. So if you want to look at female power in its own right, you've got to look at the reigning queens. So that's really the point that I would leave people with. So, if you want to see female power in its rawest form, so as head of state in their own right, you've got to look at these women.